welcome to episode 117 of the People's History of Ideas podcast. Last episode, we discussed how the Red Army conquered several counties in southern Jiangxi and western Fujian during the spring of 1929. One might assume that, given the relatively successful efforts of the communists during this period, that during this military expansion, there would have been a relative absence of conflict among the people leading the armed struggle. I know that I would have made that kind of assumption. But in fact, it was during this period of expansion that a long simmering dispute between Mao Zedong and Zhou came to the fore and line struggle broke out between the two of them. This episode, I want to dig into what happened with this conflict between the two top leaders of the Communist Armed Forces. All the way back at the end of episode 86, where we discussed the unification of the armed forces led by Mao and Zhu, we talked about how even from the very beginning, there had been some disagreements between Mao and Zhu. This disagreement largely revolved around issues of how involved the party should be in directing the activities of the army, and how much the army should participate in political work beyond their task of waging the armed struggle. Practically, this involved disagreeing about whether army commanders needed to heed direction from party leaders or not, or whether the party leadership should just butt out of many issues having to do with military affairs, essentially leaving the army to the military professionals, with Zhu being the trained military professional, as opposed to Mao Zedong not having that sort of formal training. One other way this disagreement manifested itself was over to what degree the army, when not engaged in combat operations, should disperse to carry out propaganda work and organizing activities under the party's direction, as opposed to hanging around and training and getting ready for future combat. Now, this disagreement had been simmering for about a year since Mao and Zhu had begun to work together, and in the context of the fresh advances that the Red Army was making, these political differences became more urgent, because every time the Red Army took over a new place, Mao was like, okay, let's disperse our forces around the nearby countryside and go do propaganda and organize peasants. And Zhu was essentially like, hey, let's prioritize keeping the army focused on military stuff. Now, I don't want to overstate the differences between Mao and Zhu. Clearly, they were both united on the need for a military strategy based on creating base areas, and Zhu did accept the overall need for the party to be in charge of the armed forces. But his idea of what party leadership of the armed forces looked like, or should look like, was different than what Mao's idea of that was. And there was a certain amount of personal ego involved as well. Zhu felt that Mao, as party secretary, was trying to do too many things, and that Zhu, who after all was the more experienced soldier, knew better when it came to military affairs, and he wished that Mao would quit involving himself so much in what the army was doing. And after all, when Mao and Zhu united their forces, Zhu brought many more troops into the Fourth Red Army than Mao had. But Mao and Zhu clearly worked well together despite these differences. What tipped the balance and really brought the disagreement to a head was the intervention of the party's center in the affairs of the Fourth Red Army. In episodes 114 and 115, we discussed the exchange of letters between Mao, representing the Front Committee, and Zhou Enlai, representing the party center. One thing that we noted in passing about that exchange was that even though Zhou Enlai ended up deferring to Mao because of Mao's recent military success, the party center wanted to exercise more direct control of what was going on with the Fourth Red Army. In order to exercise that control, the party center sent someone to represent the party center's political orientation and exercise the center's authority in the leadership of the Red Army. This person was named Liu Angong. Liu had joined the Chinese Communist Party while he was studying electrical engineering in Germany, and he had met Zhu while they were both in Germany. For Zhu's time in Germany, see episode 80. He also participated in the Nanchang Uprising with Zhu De, see episode 55. And after the failure of the Guangzhou Uprising, episodes 74 to 75, he was sent to the Soviet Union for a year to be trained as an artillery officer. Now back in China, he was being entrusted by the party center to be the agent of the center's authority in the Fourth Red Army. Liu arrived in early May and immediately took up a position as secretary of the Provisional Army Committee and also replaced Mao as the director of the Army's political department. Now, this Provisional Army Committee that Liu Angong took over the secretaryship of needs some explanation. The command structure of the Fourth Red Army at the time had the Front Committee at the top, and then the Front Committee gave orders directly to the leadership committees at the head of the different army formations. Now, while the Fourth Red Army had been occupying the Jinggangshan, there had been an army committee directly below the Front Committee as a kind of layer of organization between the Front Committee and the different regiments of the Red Army. However, when the Red Army fled the Jinggangshan, in recognition of the need for the Front Committee to be able to quickly and nimbly be able to deliver orders to the organizational layers below it during the extended retreat, the Army Committee had been abolished because in those circumstances all it did was to add an unnecessary layer of bureaucracy. But now that the Red Army had begun to conquer new base areas again, Zhu De had been focusing in on the need for the Army Committee to be reinstated, precisely as a way of insulating the army from Mao's demands that the army engage in political activity. In Zhu's view, the Front Committee, with Mao as the secretary, would have to give orders through the Army Committee, and then the Army Committee could dilute Mao's efforts to politicize the army and to make the army engage in political activities other than fighting. Liu Angong, perhaps because of his previous association with Zhu De, and also apparently because he felt a kinship with Zhu because they were both Sichuanese, and also because the party center saw Mao as a bigger problem to get control over than it did Zhu De. For all these reasons, it seems that Liu immediately took Zhu De's side and formed this Provisional Army Committee when he arrived in the Red Army in early May. But while he took this action more or less immediately upon joining up with the Fourth Red Army, this was just a provisional action until meetings could be held and a proper decision could be reached. That's why it was called a Provisional Army Committee. The first meeting where this issue was taken up and seriously hashed out was at a meeting of the Front Committee at the end of May. One side began by arguing that since it is called the Fourth Army, it is necessary to have an army committee. But soon some arguments which more clearly articulated the issue from the perspective of those wanting to have an army committee were made. The Front Committee was criticized for meddling in too many affairs and for creating an over-centralized authority. And Mao was criticized for exercising a secretarial dictatorship and acting like a patriarchal authority. These are the terms that were used in the criticism. This isn't me paraphrasing. Those in favor of concentrating power in the hands of the Front Committee and therefore not having a separate army committee argued that while the Front Committee was in charge of overall political work, the center of gravity of its work remained in the army because of the nature of the mixing of the political and armed struggles. And so in order to retain a centralized and agile army command, the system should remain where the Front Committee exercised direct control over army affairs, that having a separate army committee constituted a division of powers that would hamper the communists' unified effort. No consensus was reached at this meeting. So on June 8th, an enlarged meeting of the Front Committee was held, this time attended by 41 people. At this meeting, which is known as the Baisha Conference because it was held in a town in Fujian called Baisha, the arguments were all made again, but with a much bigger group participating. The results were somewhat mixed. On the one hand, the meeting overwhelmingly sided with Mao's and others' arguments that the Army Committee was an encumbrance. The vote went 36-5 to abolish the Army Committee, which makes it seem that the only people who supported that idea were the handful of comrades who had insisted on setting it up to begin with to avoid going along with Mao's policies as leader of the Front Committee. On the other hand, Mao was subjected to some pretty heavy criticism in this meeting for the way in which he dealt with subordinates. If you read Mao's selected works, the Mao that you will encounter there most often comes off, in my opinion, as a kind of very patient and understanding teacher. But apparently, in 1929, in person at least, a lot of people felt that he had been pretty authoritarian and short-tempered in his dealings with subordinates. Looking at everything that the Red Army had been through with the month-long retreat from the Jinggangshan and all, it's hard to see how someone would not get testy at times. And aside from the fact that this meeting on June 8th decided to re-abolish the Army Committee, it did not really decide against the various criticisms that Zhou and Liu Angong had been making of Mao's insistence that the army prioritize political tasks and not be overwhelmingly focused just on military affairs. The criticism of Mao at this meeting was serious enough that Mao wrote a letter of resignation, although this may have been a maneuver on Mao's part to get the other comrades to back down and insist that he not resign in recognition of the important role that he had been playing in leading the army. Apparently, Mao said during the meeting that, quote, "I cannot bear this sort of untenable responsibility, and I ask that you immediately replace me as secretary," end quote. So, while the Army Committee issue was resolved, the larger issues that were in dispute were still not resolved. The temporary resolution of these issues would have to wait until June 22nd, when the Fourth Red Army held its 7th Party Congress in Longyan. However, between the June 8th meeting and the June 22nd Congress, Mao had the opportunity to lay out his position in some depth, and I want to look in detail at what Mao wrote. The document that we're going to look at here is a letter that Mao wrote to Lin Biao on June 14th in response to a letter that Lin wrote to Mao directly following the June 8th meeting. Lin's letter hasn't been published, but in it he urged Mao not to resign from the Front Committee. In it he also denounced Zhu's ambitions and also Zhu's efforts to ingratiate himself with the rank-and-file soldiers. He criticized Zhu and Liu Angong for forming invisible cliques and wrote that they had egotistically launched attacks on other comrades. And it does appear that the political crisis within the Fourth Red Army deepened in the days after the June 8th meeting, as people who were at the meeting began discussing the leadership crisis among cadres and soldiers lower down in the organizational hierarchy who were not supposed to know about the disagreements going on at the top of the organization. Now, Mao's June 14th response to Lin is a little long, but it's a key document for understanding Mao's thinking about what it meant for the army to be led by the party, or in language that would later become popular, how politics should control the gun. And rather than just expressing this as a platitude, the document gives us an opportunity to understand how this politics came to be articulated not in the abstract, but in concrete historical circumstances and in direct opposition to Zhu, who would have said that he agreed that ultimately, in the final analysis, if you will, the party should be in charge of the army, but who meant something different than Mao did when he said that. So let's take a close look at this letter that Mao wrote, in which he sent not only to Lin Biao, but also to the Front Committee, so that it could be read more widely and discussed. Comrade Lin Biao, 1. I am greatly moved by your letter, and my courage is strengthened because you are bravely moving forward. I will work with you and all the comrades who are for the unity of the party and the advancement of the revolution, against all harmful views, habits, and systems. The question under dispute at present is not a question which concerns one individual or a particular moment. It is a question concerning the entire party of the Fourth Army and the struggle which has been going on for a year. Previously it was, however, concealed for various reasons, and it has been exposed only recently. In fact, The past concealment was wrong, and the current exposure is the only proper course. When controversy arises over questions within the party, this represents progress for the party, not retrogression. It is retrogression only if one compromises, muddles through, and erases the line between the two sides, thereby reducing important matters to insignificance in a vulgar way. I think this time it will not lead to fearful and evil consequences. Only a few days after the Baisha conference, the question has already been hotly debated among the masses in the party. I think our comrades will definitely demand a thorough clarification of this question and will definitely refuse to compromise, sit on the fence, and be blind to the distinction between right and wrong. They will certainly be able to choose and support a view that promotes the unity of the party and the advancement of the revolution. There is absolutely no doubt that through this, the work of transforming the Fourth Army can be completed, and as a result, the party of the Fourth Army can make extremely great progress. So here in this introductory paragraph, we can see that Mao is glad that the ongoing dispute with Zhu has erupted into an open line struggle so that cadres and soldiers far below the level of the Front Committee can discuss and debate the issues and reach a higher level of political understanding through the debate and struggle. Continuing with the letter. 2. One cannot understand the origins of the current debate without knowing the history of the struggle in the Fourth Army. Without an understanding of this origin, one cannot understand the nature of the entire problem in the struggle between two different systems of thought since the initiation of the Fourth Army. Among the key points of this problem are the following. 1. Individual leadership and party leadership. 2. The military point of view and the political point of view. 3. Cliquism and anti-cliquism. 4. The roving rebel mentality and the anti-roving rebel mentality. 5. The question of political power in the middle section of the Luoxiao mountain range. That's the Jinggangshan. 6. The question of local armed forces. 7. Urban policy and the question of Red Army discipline. 8. The assessment of the current situation. 9. The defeat in southern Hunan. 10. The question of a scientific approach and of regularization. 11. The question of military skills in the Fourth Army. 12. Formalism and utilitarianism. 13. The separation of powers and the concentration of power. 14. Other decadent ideas. Let me speak about them below. Here in the letter's second paragraph, Mao lists the 14 points on which he's going to criticize Zhu, Liu Angong, and their supporters in the rest of the letter below. So let's see how he continues. 3. The main question for the party of the Fourth Army is that of individual leadership and party leadership. To discuss this question, we must first of all remember that the greater part of the Fourth Army was born out of the Old Army. Moreover, it was brought forth in an environment of defeat. If we remember these 2 points, we can then understand why all the ideas, habits, and systems are so difficult to change, and why party leadership and individual leadership are always in opposition, and have long been in a state of conflict. Since the Red Army emerged from the transformation of the Old Army, it brought with it a conflict between supporters of all the old ideas, old habits, and old systems, and some who fight against these ideas, habits, and systems. This is the first reason why up to now it has not yet been possible to establish absolute party leadership in the Fourth Army. Moreover, the greater part of the Fourth Army emerged in an environment of defeat. This was in 1927, and the party organization that put it together was the one from before the defeat, which was extremely weak in the first place and lost the leadership completely in the course of the defeat. It can be said that survival at the time depended 9 times out of 10 solely on the leadership of the individual. It is this which created the enormous power of the individual leader. That is the second reason why it has not been possible to establish absolute party leadership in the Fourth Army. Having understood these two causes, if we then look again at the history of the Fourth Army since it was organized, we can understand the central factor in the ebb and flow of the struggle between the individual and the party. Since the Fourth Army was established, the party has established a basis everywhere at the company level and above. Now that the policy of the higher leading bodies, the Special Committee of the Hunan-Jiangxi border area and the Fourth Army's Army Committee and Front Committee, is correct, and with the establishment of local party branches in the various counties of the border region, and the development of the mass struggle, the role of the individual has been gradually reduced and the leadership of the party has been strengthened. In general, this can be divided into three periods. The first period is from the creation of the Fourth Army to September of last year, when we returned to the border area. It includes the victories in a series of battles in the border area and the defeat in southern Hunan. In this period, the party was unable to wield the absolute power of command. Cliquism existed widely and was on the rise. The party dared not attempt to allocate and transfer the guns. There were clashes between the principle of giving attention to all aspects of the rear area of the Red Army and the selfish departmentalism of a minority of Red Army comrades. It was not possible to establish a system of military supplies or regulations regarding the organization of the army. Individual control over politics and weapons was common. From the company to the corps, the party as it existed at that time was in reality in a subordinate position, and regarding certain issues, it was absolutely obliged to accept the orders of an individual. End quote. One thing I just want to clarify and explain from this paragraph here is what Mao says about how the party dared not attempt to allocate and transfer the guns and related things he said in this paragraph. This might be a surprise for people who are used to thinking of armies as having clear command structures that everyone naturally always obeys or has to obey, and resources can be distributed by leadership in whatever way the leadership wants, allowing, of course, for logistical difficulties. But as Mao says here, this was not the case for many of the weapons and other supplies in the Fourth Red Army's possession. Mao's using this as a striking illustration of the way in which individualism manifested itself in the Red Army, where if, say, the party leadership thought that some arms needed to be redistributed from one regiment to another or to the local militia, this was not always actually feasible because there was a tendency to hoard resources or to take a me first or my regiment first attitude based, as Mao describes here, both on the survival of individualistic attitudes from life before joining the revolution and also from the fact that party leadership had broken down in the context of the military defeats of 1927, which understandably reinforced individual self-reliance among revolutionary soldiers at that time. And apparently this was particularly the case with the 28th Regiment of the 4th Red Army, which was at its core made up of Juda's veterans of the Nanchang Uprising. Okay, let's continue with the letter. The second period was from last September, when we returned to the border area, to March 14th, when we took Dingzhou. During this period, the party was first able to criticize cliquism theoretically, even though it still could not really do it. A system of military supplies was set up. The system of 75 long-barreled guns per company was set up, but it did not yet extend to short-barreled guns. It was not so difficult as in the first period to transfer guns to the localities. In this period, a minority of comrades tried hard to bow their heads, and the party was really in a commanding position. This was so in general from the party branch to the front committee. There were several obvious characteristics during this period. First, the situation created by the Hunan defeat and the flight of most of the remaining forces. The individual did not manifest much effective leadership. At the same time, unlike the first period, when there was a series of military victories, now there was the possibility of collapse if we did not rely on party leadership. This is the first reason why party leadership gained ground. Second, during this period, as compared to the first period, There was indeed some progress in party organization, as well as in the political consciousness and experience of struggle among the comrades. It was more difficult for the incorrect words and actions of a minority of comrades to gain support from the rank and file. As a result, these people had to restrain themselves somewhat. This is the second reason why party leadership gained ground. Third, in this period, we encountered two fresh friendly forces, the Fifth Army and the 2nd and 4th Regiments. The Fifth Army could not influence the Fourth Army much, but it did provide some stimulus to the Fourth Army in smashing cliquism, particularly at the Bailu meeting. In discussing the merging of the Fourth and Fifth Armies, Comrade Peng Dehuai's indignant remarks dealt quite a blow to the minority of comrades. As for the 2nd and 4th Regiments, the comrades of the Fourth Army were truly ashamed to see them. Their political instructors exercised authority over the officers. In the first 5 registers, the names of the officers were placed after those of the political instructors. They cannot allocate one bullet without asking the party. They have absolute party leadership. This can also be identified as a factor which helped to strengthen the leadership of the party in the Fourth Army. Here, when Mao talks about the political instructors or the commissars being above the officers in the registers, we're talking about rank in the muster rolls here. So what he's indicating is that the political commissars ranked higher than the officers in those regiments. One other thing to note in this paragraph, when Mao refers to the individual not manifesting effective leadership in relation to the August defeat, see episodes 93 and 94, and to the incorrect words and actions of a minority of comrades, he's clearly referring to Zhu and his closest supporters, but diplomatically not naming him. Everyone reading this would have known who he was referring to, though. The Bailu Conference was that meeting which was held right before the retreat from the Jinggangshan began, which we discussed in episode 100. And we can see here once again how impressed Mao was with the political control that the Donggu base area leadership had over the regiments that were based there, as expressed in how the party exercised control down to the distribution of individual bullets. And of course, as I just mentioned, the political commissars outranking the military officers. For a refresher on that, see episodes 109 and 110. Okay, back to the letter. All right, because this next paragraph is really long, I'm going to intersperse my comments just within it, especially because none of my comments are really all that long. Quote, "The third period is from Zhou to the present. During this period, the party and the Red Army have truly progressed in all areas as compared to the previous situation. Because of the establishment of the first, second, and third columns, cliquism really began to weaken." Okay, what Mao's referring to here is something we didn't cover in the past few episodes, but one thing that happened after the conquest of Chongqing is there was a reorganization of the Red Army, and the old regiments were abolished, and now the troops were reorganized into these 3 columns that made up the Red Army. Continuing with the letter. The column committees were somewhat more effective than the front committee. Party branches at all levels could discuss various issues without misgivings. The number of short-barreled guns could also be regulated. The establishment of the political department also limited the authority of the headquarters. Just in case it's not clear, here the headquarters is referring purely to the military headquarters. And so Mao's clearly saying, look, we had this political department and it was able to have more authority over the people handling the more purely military affairs. Continuing with the letter. These are the organizational aspects. As far as the political line is concerned, an effort could be made in their work to carry out the political tasks delineated at the 6th Congress, which, just in my opinion, is Mao making the politically de rigueur necessary reference to the political line of the 6th Congress. I'm not exactly sure Mao was all that influenced by that at all. Continuing with the letter. Urban policy was somewhat better applied. Progress was made in propaganda. they learned the tactics of large-scale guerrilla warfare. As a result of the development of the situation, the organization of the Red Army was also expanded. But because the will of the party was very greatly extended, the will of the individual underwent unprecedented suffering. Then there were several military victories in a row, and a formalistic theory arrived from afar. This is just a euphemism where Mao is saying the formalistic theory arriving from afar is Liu Angong coming back from the Soviet Union and having relatively little experience of the revolution in China itself. Certainly some with participating in the Nanchang Uprising and the Guangzhou Uprising, but Mao's kind of slamming Liu Angong there as bringing theories from afar without having the practice to back himself up. Continuing with the letter. These three factors combine to bring about the outbreak of the current dispute. The focal point of the controversy is whether we still need the party branch in the present-day army. Because a minority of comrades firmly insisted on having an army committee, they had to attack the front committee. This, in turn, impinged on the question of the party organization itself. The slogans of their attack were, "The party runs too many things," and "Power is too much concentrated in the front committee." When, in the course of the controversies, the discussion touched on the work of the party branch, some said that the branch should be concerned only with the education of the comrades. This also arose from the question of the sphere of the party's authority. Because they advocated that the sphere of the party's interference should be restricted, they had to demand limits on the work of the party branch as well. With the expansion of the will of the party and the restriction of the will of the individual, all questions had to be the subject of resolutions by party meetings at various levels. Only then could the party members as individuals carry out their work according to those resolutions. Thus, the individual did not enjoy the freedom of the hero. And here with Mao referencing the freedom of the hero, it's hard not to feel like he's referencing on some level in his mind his old thinking from his anarchist past that we explored all the way back in episode 14, where Mao was saying China needed all these heroes. Anyways, that's something that stood out to me and has stood out to other people reading this document. Continuing with the letter. As a result, their demand for considerable freedom found expression in such slogans as, "Do we have to ask the party even about one gun?" and "Should the party take care of the groom when he runs out of things to eat?" deriding the work of the party bureaus regarding minute details. Such are the views they expressed at the Hulé meeting of the Front Committee. That was the meeting at the end of May that we discussed earlier in this episode. Continuing with the letter. Although the questions under discussion were divided into three, the scope of the party's power, the work of the party branch, and the lack of freedom for the individual, the spirit was the same throughout. This is the concrete manifestation of the struggle for supremacy between party leadership and the leadership of the individual. Since the recent controversies emerged, some comrades have felt that the party in the Fourth Army has arrived at a crisis. If the individualist leadership exercised by a minority of comrades is victorious, the result, as you said in your letter, will inevitably be that the close unity of the party will be disrupted and the future prospects of the revolution will be harmed. But I am confident it will not come to this, because the party of the Fourth Army at present has made obvious progress since the first and second periods. The foundations of the various columns can no longer be shaken. Decisions based on the selfish desires of the individual will be rejected by the masses. We need only look at the fact that at a meeting attended by 41 people, the Army Committee, which a minority of comrades obstinately insisted on establishing, was abolished by a vote of 36-5 in order to see that the majority will definitely not support their demand, which is harmful to solidarity and harmful to the revolution. The struggle between individualism and anti-individualism, that is to say, between individual leadership and party leadership, is the main thread that runs through the history of the Fourth Army. generally speaking, on the following questions, each one of them, there are none on which there are not diametrically opposed viewpoints. Let us simply try to list them." End quote. So at this point in the letter now, Mao is going to go on and explore a number of these other points that he listed earlier when he listed these 14 different issues that were that were manifestations of the divide between Judah and himself. And so I think there's a lot left in this letter, and I want to keep reading it. So I think we'll just continue with that next episode. The letter is going to continue with point 4, where Mao's going to take up the question of the roving rebel band mentality, which is always a fun topic. So I hope you will tune in next time. Until then, be well and take care.